Welcome to Academia Europea's webinar on research integrity, dealing with how we can support and protect early career researchers in cases of scientific misconduct. I'm Ole Petersen, and it's my privilege to chair this webinar. Scientific misconduct covers, in my opinion, a broad range of what we might call misdeeds, ranging from data fabrication and falsification to sloppiness and what I would call relative incompetence. Quantitatively, I think that sloppiness and relative incompetence, including inadequate experimental design and technique, are the most important factors behind what may be a reproducibility crisis. This means that, in my opinion, the most important protection of early career researchers is education, training, and clear guidance as to what is required. This is, to some extent, a subject-specific matter because rules and how things work are quite different in different subject areas. In my own area of animal research, we have tried to create a clear guidance. And a couple of years ago, I accepted an invitation from Sir Stephen Holgate, who chaired the international committee that produced new guidelines for reporting animal research. And after several years of deliberations, we published last summer in July, updated so-called Arrival guidelines for reporting animal research. This has been taken up amazingly quickly by the community, and surprisingly, to me at least, this paper has already been cited more than 250 times in the scientific literature. So guidance can be very helpful, can be a major protection for early career researchers. However, this webinar today is mainly dealing with the more sort of severe cases of deliberate, intended fraud. And so this is a question of truthfulness and being honest in reporting science. And the slide that I hope is on the screen now from Ingmar Bergman's famous film Fanny Alexander relates to a scene where the bishop in Uppsala is interrogating his stepson Alexander, who has been telling lies in school about his family. And the bishop starts the interrogation by asking him, why do people tell lies? And Alexander very perceptively and very quickly replies, to gain an advantage. The bishop commends him for this very good answer and says, yes, exactly, that's exactly what happens. So in scientific literature, we can ask the question, why do some people engage in fabrication of data, falsification, telling untruths? So it is in order to gain an advantage, either to become more famous without actually doing the work involved in it, or for some other motives to satisfy themselves. Is it successful in the sciences? I would say not, because actually a paper based on scientific fraud will probably only survive in areas that is of almost no interest to anybody else. In that case, such a scientific paper could well survive for many years without being challenged because nobody is interested in it. We know that about 50% of the biomedical scientific literature is never cited by anybody, including the authors themselves. However, there is not too much to gain in that case. The gain could only come from perpetrating fraud in a high impact area where there's a lot of interest. But in those areas, there will be immediate scrutiny of the paper, and you won't have any gain because very quickly it will be found that the data are not reliable. And in that case, because it's a high profile area, your name will be exposed and your career will be finished. So it's probably not a particularly good strategy, and probably there shouldn't be too much incentive actually to do it. Nevertheless, it does happen. Today, to debate these and related issues, we have a very distinguished panel headed by Baruch Fischhof, a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences from Carnegie Mellon University. We have Dr. Barry Dewitt from the same institution. We have two representatives of the Young Academy of Europe, the chair, Dr. Gemma Modinos, and the vice chair, Professor Monique Tromp. And last but not least, we have Niels Erik Salin from Lund University, who is a member of the European Commission's European Group on Ethics in Science and Technologies. If you have any questions, then there will be a chance to debate these after these five people have given their short papers. Please put your questions into the Q&A box. Make it short and sweet, as concise as possible, because that increases the probability that your question will be picked. And so without further ado, I would now like to give the floor to Baruch Fischhof. So please, Baruch.
Thank you, Ola. Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank everybody for coming to this webinar. I'm grateful for the opportunity to present and discuss with you the paper that I wrote together, that was written together. It's a collaborative project with Barry DeWitt and Alex Davis, who are younger scientists who are more in touch with their reality, and Niels Erik and myself, who are at least have longer familiarity with the institutions that are meant to protect and promote them. Together, we noticed that we identified this social dilemma that we see as all too common. We have individuals with limited personal power. They see and experience misconduct. If they do anything on their own, they risk retaliation by the perpetrator. There could be collective action that would neutralize that power, could bring them justice and reduce future risk. However, there's no coordinating mechanisms that provides all parties with warranted protection. And as a result, the individuals suffer and societies suffer. We're focused on research misconduct, but structurally you find similar things with sexual assault, racial, ethnic, and gender harassment and discrimination, bullying, and other forms of social abuse. But our job is to take care of our own world first. As Ola mentioned, there is a reproducibility crisis in some area that's been detected in some areas in science. This is a well-known paper in psychology that found that 2/3 of existing papers published papers that they looked at in social psychology, and 1/3 of those in cognitive psychology could not be reproduced for some set of reasons, some of which may have been misconduct. So the individuals, the early career scientists who are involved suffer. They have coerced collaboration and misconduct with individual projects. They have pressure to accept normalized pathology in the science that they hope to devote their careers to. They've compromised interpersonal relationships with the people whom they trusted, and they have fear and sometimes reality of retaliation if they say anything. And then society suffers because there's a corruption of the scientific record. There's deception of those who depend on specific research. There's erosion of public trust in science because these stories come out. And then there's, in effect, a race to the bottom, promoting quantity and glitz over quality and prudence in the production of scientific research, because the grants and the notoriety may go to people who produce the results that are too good to be true. So in our deliberations, we concluded that a coordinating mechanism to allow for collective action needs to listen to the victims, respect their experience, and help them to interpret it. It needs to allow the victims of misconduct to control their story and their actions. It needs to enable collective action that could redress the power imbalance through social sanctions, not necessarily legal ones. It needed to navigate the legal and institutional constraints on collective action. And it also needs to protect the powerful from unjust accusations. So we decided that the mechanism that we have devised, and which Barry will be explaining in just a minute, we concluded needed to have each of these properties in the title. It needed to be secure in order to protect the confidentiality of the individuals involved. It needed to be a procedure so that it was predictable and replicable. So we're establishing a norm through our community. It needed to be focused on the needs and vulnerabilities of early career scientists who have limited power and a long future in their own lives and their ability to contribute to science and society. It needed to focus on the particular norms and community of science and reinforce our norms. It needed to be a mechanism for reporting, which did not coerce action on the part of people involved. And it needed to recognize that it is dealing with apparent misconduct, that it may be unclear to early career scientists what they have experienced, and they need the help of somebody with wisdom who can help them to interpret it and act as necessary. So Barry will now discuss the mechanism that we propose that has these properties. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Baruch, for a nice introduction. And I'll give the floor immediately to Barry Dewitt. So Barry, please.
Thank you. Yes, let me just pull up the slides. Okay, so I'll briefly describe what we propose in our paper. So as Baruch was saying, our focus really here is on describing a mechanism that prioritizes the well-being of early career scientists above all else. And it does that by maximizing the control that early career scientists have over the process of reporting an issue of scientific misconduct. Crucially, that means that even in the case of an unambiguous allegation of scientific misconduct, no action is required unless the person making the submission wants to proceed with an action. But it also aims to facilitate collective action, rather, given that, as Baruch was describing, we see collective action as a very effective way of pursuing these issues. It also aimed to have a mechanism to provide a protection to senior faculty when apparent scientific misconduct is in fact a reasonable error or an honest mistake. So the process has three main steps. So there's the individual submission step, where an early career scientist or any researcher in the institution makes a submission to this scientific integrity official, and I'll describe them in a moment. That official then monitors reports looking for patterns about the same scientist or the same lab, and then helps coordinate the submissions. And one possible outcome of that coordination is collective action. So I'll describe these in turn, but first describe the scientific integrity official, which is, in our view, someone who is really key to this process. And as described, it might not be the easiest person to find, but we think it's certainly not impossible to find someone who meets these requirements. So this has to be someone with real technical skills, probably a scientist themselves or a retired scientist, because they have to understand the various ways scientific misconduct can appear in the academy. And they also have to be able to disambiguate honest mistakes from true scientific misconduct. They need interpersonal skills, not only because of the possibly vulnerable feeling early career scientists who are approaching them with these reports, but also because they need to be unintimidated by the strong personalities that exist in the university, including among senior and tenured faculty. They also have to have deep institutional knowledge, understanding the full range of resources available to the submitter, and including if they want to take their submission to a further along. So in that individual submission process, a researcher would make a report to a scientific integrity official. The official would provide guidance on that submission, helping them to understand what they've seen. Also provide access to resources. So that could be everything from the relevant administrative resources. Some institutions, particularly in the US, have something called a dean of students, which can be useful. But also, if you take an hour of your time and you look at grad student Twitter, you won't take long to see that being in a lab where scientific misconduct exists causes real suffering. And so certainly something like understanding the counseling services available to an early career scientist could be useful as well. Crucially, this all has to be confidential, and crucially, there's no requirement for action unless the submitter wants action. That scientific integrity official would then monitor reports looking for patterns. And when a pattern emerges, the official would contact each submitter, letting them know that other submissions exist, and then asking each submitter if they can, rather the scientific integrity official can reveal any other details about their individual submissions to the group. And those details could be everything from nothing, just the existence of another report, fully to coordinating joint meetings to discuss the issue. We see sort of 4 possible outcomes from this kind of coordination. One might be acceptable inaction when the people who have filed the reports come to see the events more charitably. There could be bitter inaction when people decide that it's not worth the risk to continue. There could be joint action when the group decides to move forward using the proper administrative channels. Or there could be individual action when a submitter decides that they can take the risks on themselves, even without a group, to pursue the allegation. So in summary, our belief is that we need to prioritize the well-being of early career scientists in creating a mechanism of this kind. We think it will protect science by deterring future misconduct, but certainly to adopt it, it would not necessarily be easy. I think students and faculty would have to campaign for it, and it might require the changes of laws and regulations in order to maintain that confidentiality piece to ensure that there is no duty to report, that the control is all in the hands of the early career scientists making the submission. So I'll stop it there. Thank you again for the panel.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry, for this presentation. And we now move on to the Young Academy of Europe. And I invite the chair of the Young Academy, Gemma Modinas, to give your presentation. So Gemma, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting the Young Academy of Europe to partner up for this webinar. When we read the article, we appreciated the overall positive way in which it was framed around such a serious and difficult and delicate issue, and the fact that it includes a proposal that essentially it aims to protect early career researchers and to empower them to safely report cases of scientific misconduct. So we think that this will not only benefit ECRs, but also, as it has been pointed out, research culture in general, and even the public perception of science and academia. In cases of scientific misconduct, or even other types of misconduct in academia, such as discrimination or abuse, we think that too much emphasis and responsibility is placed often on the individuals at the receiving end. So basically, you don't only witness or suffer it, but also it's on you to report it and suffer the potential negative consequences of doing so. So something very important from the proposal in this paper is that the aim is to put a system in place to protect individuals at the receiving end. And of course, the focus on early career researchers is particularly important as they are in a more vulnerable position because of the dependence on supervisors for their academic and career progression, and because they typically don't have long-term job security, and because of the power and influence imbalance between established and junior researchers. So if ECRs don't feel safe, then calling things out is much less likely to happen. So as the Young Academy of Europe, this is a pan-European network of excellent young group leaders working together to provide scientific advice for policy from a younger perspective, but also to protect the present and future of early and mid-career scholars. So as a pan-European network, we appreciate how scientific misconduct and how it is dealt with probably varies across geography based on culture and tradition, resources and infrastructure. So it will be important to see how a proposal such as this one in the paper could and should be implemented widely. And also because of the stage at which our YAE members are when they join, we're still relatively close to our PhD and postdoc days to remember how this was. We have a responsibility to the PhDs and postdocs in our groups, but often we may still not have achieved a secure academic post, and the power imbalance and influence discrepancies are still important factors. So we thought that we were grateful to be asked our opinion on this. Mm-hmm. We, and by we mean we've discussed this in the board, and we've also disseminated to members. We've heard back from some. We think a system by which there is an independent and decentralized scientific integrity officer at the institutional level is a good way forward. A system in which the person reporting something can feel in control of to what extent things will be discussed and what steps will be followed is advantageous. One challenge here might be to make sure that the institution, if this is a person is appointed at the institutional level, that the institution is truly open to dealing with these issues without fears for their own reputation, and how this scientific integrity officer is portrayed, right? So whether it's someone that is seen as linked to HR, or instead is someone seen as independent, compassionate, who truly bears the interests of the ECRs and helping clarify issues that, and sometimes it might be that it wasn't misconduct, but helping understand what could have happened there. So we've discussed the article and the proposal among the board and disseminated to members, and we asked for feedback and questions from our membership that can stimulate a healthy discussion around this proposal and hopefully aid in dissemination and eventual implementation. So here is where I would like to pass it on to Monique, the vice chair of the YAE, who will summarize these questions and provide an overview on what we heard back from our members. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Gemma. The floor is then yours, Monique.
Thanks, Ole. Thanks, Gemma. Well, we fully agree, of course, that the topic of science integrity is very timely and very important to discuss. And I guess it's always been an issue, but in the current academic climate, with the high working load, which is still increasing for all of us, where we try to act as sheep with 5 legs, university is changing, or at least needs to change. And a lot of the common and perhaps the old-fashioned procedures which were in place are under discussion. And what I mean with this is that we see that the academic system is hyper-competitive. There's limited funding, there are limited positions, and hence researchers are under pressure from universities, funding agencies, journals, etc., to produce breakthroughs at every publication. Evaluation parameters like the use of H-index, impact factors, numbers of citations have been used to decide on funding, but also on the status and career progression of academics. And research can simply not always be innovative and groundbreaking at every stage, but the pressure is high and status and funding depend on it. So results are pushed through quickly in the highest profile papers and are such sometimes incomplete or even falsified. There's actually a huge case in physics at the moment, where based in the Netherlands, where 2 Nature papers have to be retracted because the author was called out by his former postdocs for truncating data. And maybe we can come back to this example later. So at the same time, more and more funding instruments, both nationally and European, are linked to applications. So researchers have to promise maybe too much in a proposal. True application of more fundamental science conducted at universities simply doesn't happen in 5 years, but much beyond. And whereas reporting in a safe and constructive manner is a huge step forward, I think we cannot not discuss that the system is perhaps under too much pressure and change is required there too. This is of course happening, and I guess the Netherlands is one of the countries where we are quite far in the process, which people also find scary because others will have to follow the same path, otherwise we would be left out in the science competition. So in short, what is happening, for example, is that people are not just judged on their H-index or impact factors anymore, but have a completely different rewarding system based on the full set of activities people do and want to be judged upon. Academics do not just publish, they are involved in management, teaching, science, and policy advice, etc. And if assessment criteria for both career and funding diversify, the pressure on the system and on people will hopefully decrease. The idea is that people will excel in their qualities and their strengths rather than all trying to do all. For science and science funding, this might, for example, mean being judged on science proposal and a narrative CV, where you explain how your background and strengths fit best the proposal. And some policy or management tasks might actually give more impact than 1 or 2 extra high-profile publications. So that might reduce the pressure and thus the need for falsifying data. So to come back to the paper and the approach proposed here, on paper this sounds very good and logic and fair, but we have unfortunately experienced, so our members, but also myself in the different countries around Europe, that in practice this is very complicated. So there have been quite some development in countries in Europe, like in the Netherlands, where university confidential counselors or so-called ombudspersons are installed to deal with science integrity, but also harassment cases. And some analysis have been done and pilots have been run. And one of the problems we see here, which was also mentioned by Gemma, is the independence of these people. Can they truly act independently and impartially, and do they have any power in the institute? What has been observed in many places is that people affected, so people who want to report, do not know how to contact the counselor, do not know where he or she is. But even if they do, they don't trust them, because this counselor will also help the person who is being reported, a senior academic who brings in a lot of money for the university. And then what we see is that the counselor either takes sides or cannot do anything. So what we observe is that even if complaints are being reported, they're not followed through, and or that the system protects the senior academic. So universities do take this more and more seriously, since some appalling stories have come out in the news over the last few years. And so there are now, for example, universities where these counselors are taken out of the institutes, are put much higher up in the governance, and are often even advising the university management directly. The problem, however, for young academics is still the hierarchy and their dependency relations. So the groups and fields are often very small and tight. So the anonymity is very difficult to maintain. Even if the person is not named, it can often be traced back. In the physics example mentioned before, the postdocs only came out in the open after having left the group, and they now get strong support on, for example, social media. So implementing a solid procedure requires serious thought and effort, which I think everyone is willing to make, but it's not so easy to do. And I hope this is something we can maybe discuss further in a bit today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Monique. I think you raised some quite important points, which definitely will be the focus of the discussion. So we now come to Niels-Erik Salin's presentation. So please take the floor, Niels-Erik.
Thank you. Yesterday, or the day before yesterday, I read an article in Bioethics by Hugh Desmond and Chris Diedrichs, and it's inspired me very much. So I will take off from that. And they are discussing the research codes around Europe. And they say that the longest one is the Swedish, which is 44,000 words, and the shortest one is the Norwegian, which is just 900 words. And I was the chairman of the group who in 2015 to 17 rewrote the Swedish Code of Conduct. It is today one of the most downloaded books from the National Research Council's webpage. And I think, or I hope that it shows that research codes play a role. They are important, and science thinks they are important. And policymakers have been very concerned about harmonizing research integrity standards around or across Europe. And there are two good examples of this. And one is, of course, the European Federation of Academies of Sciences and Humanities, ALEA, and their European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, which was published or republished in 2017. Another good example is the European Group of Ethics and their statement from around the same time, on the formulation of a code of conduct for research integrity for projects funded by the European Commission. Despite this, Desmond and Diederik says, has almost every European country they have looked at today its own national level code of conduct for research integrity. There is very little that we agree on. There's one thing that all countries seem to agree on, and that is that fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism constitute research misconduct. But besides that, there is not much agreement. And this worries Desmond and Diederik, and I think for good reasons. One of the things they think is a problem is that fairness in dealing with the allegations of misconduct can vary. Another thing is that the codes might just be window dressing. They have no effect whatsoever. I strongly believe that a secure procedure for scientists to report apparent misconduct can help avoiding the problems that these two scientists pinpoint and are discussing. And such a procedure, I think, can force us to discuss questions relating to reliability, honesty, respect for colleagues, and accountability, all things that are important when you're dealing with misconduct. And as we say in the paper, it can help us avoid bitter action, or inaction, I should say. In many cases, what is needed here is action in one way or another. And more important than anything else, I think here, is to give the young scientist the help he or she needs in a situation of this kind. I think that Desmond and Diederik's paper and our paper shows how important, or I hope it does, it is that we, on a European level, and maybe probably on a global level, make sure that we have a secure procedure for scientists to report misconduct. It will help us to, at an early stage, detect misconduct and hopefully be able to do something about it before the problem becomes too infectious, because it's easy that it becomes infectious. If there is a plan to rewrite the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, I hope ALEA, maybe together with Academia Europea and the young academies, will address the serious problem that Alex, Barry, Brooke, and I address in our paper, and suggest a joint secure procedure for scientists to report misconduct. That's it.
Thank you very much, Nils-Erik, and thank you to all of you for keeping to time and keeping things really nice and concise. So I think we all agree there is an issue here. It may not be the dominant issue in science, but it is an important issue. Before we come to many of the specific, most of the questions that have come in so far are very, very specific questions which can be addressed quickly. But I think to put things a little bit into context, I would just like to take up some of the points that particularly Monique mentioned. My personal experience as head of a large bioscience department in 3 different universities for more than 30 years is that it is indeed the case, as Monique said, that when something happens, the person who suffers in the end is the early career researcher. The situation is often quite a bit more complex, perhaps, than has been indicated. Because the biggest problem, as I have seen in all the cases where I have been called in as either expert or representative of a university, is that very often it is not a simple situation where a early career researcher detects that a senior person has done something wrong. Much more typical is that there is an atmosphere in the research group where there are certain requirements that something should happen in a particular way. And very often the early career researcher becomes, in a sense, complicit in this process. And then it comes out that by anonymous education or something like that, questions are raised about the paper. Then a commission is set up, there's a scrutiny and so on, and in almost all cases, one finds that there are various things that were not quite right. And the senior investigator obviously has a very major responsibility for having not supervised things properly. In most cases, there's no particular attempt by the senior investigator deliberately to create a fraud situation, but the person may have signposted quite often, quite clearly, what he or she expects should come out of the investigation. Some pressure has been exerted on the early career researcher to deliver, as it were. And as I say, you get into a very complex situation. The end result is almost in all cases, every single case I've been involved in this case, that the junior researcher will be sacked and the senior researcher remains in post, because often there's a big grant holder, as Monique said, and it is not in the institution's interest to really do something about it. And very often the senior researcher does not actually, strictly speaking, having committed any fraud. That is, in my opinion, the typical case. But that person has created an atmosphere that has induced other people to overstep their mark, and suddenly it is then realized that things have gone a little bit too far. So it's a very complex situation. I personally think the initiative that has been taken is a good one. I don't think it is a solution to the majority of the problems, quite frankly, but it's a good thing, and it's a good thing for a young person to be able to discuss with somebody else all the implications of it. But as I say, at least the vast majority of cases I've been involved in, and unfortunately I've had to deal with quite a few such cases in a long career, they are not straightforward, actually. Not at all. So that's just sort of my observation. But let's come to some concrete questions from some of the people who have come in. Some of them are clear-cut, some of them a little bit less. I'm not quite sure about the first one from a Tony Husa, who says, informed consent is a generally accepted ethical principle in social science research. But under what circumstances is it ethically acceptable to override this principle? Not totally clear to me exactly where that is leading, but would anybody like to take that question? Maybe Baruch, very experienced person. Do you see where that person, what he or she is driving at?
I do. I have lots of opinions, but I don't think they're a particular merit here. If I'm talking, I mean, it's not germane to what we've done here. I don't feel like I have any particular expertise, but let me pick up on a couple of things. So I think, I think Barry touched effectively on just how painful this is to the early career researchers who are involved, and I'm really grateful to Emma and Monique and their colleagues for having brought out these issues. And in thinking about our paper, I think that we perhaps didn't make it as clear that the most powerful weapon here, which early career researchers have, is one that Ola alluded to in his open remarks, which is public shaming. That is, many cases, we don't know whether we're seeing the tip of the iceberg about research misconduct of the various times. The junior early career researchers, they see it. If they are able to coordinate their actions, then, but through public shaming, they can discredit the person or people who hold power over them. And this is not just a retraction of an individual study, but potentially, which one of the questioners asked, but potentially cast doubt on an entire pattern of research, because the study that, with the misconduct that they have seen, may be, if they are convinced that this is a pattern, may have been practiced throughout an entire pattern of research. And for those reasons, we, as people have said, this is very complicated. It varies by situations, requires clear deliberation. But we tended to think that this needed to be outside of the jurisdictional control of the institution, so that it would not be silenced and would not be silenced. So perhaps let me leave it there.
Okay, thank you. I think there's an interesting specific question here, which I would like to come up. So here's a person who says, procedures for handling suspicions of research misconduct often involve an obligation to report such suspicions. The procedure proposed in your paper presupposes that one can make exceptions from such a general obligation. Do you see a problem with that? Niels Erik?
Of course, there's a problem with that, and we have got many comments on the paper. And in Sweden, for example, in other countries, you are not allowed to keep things secret. If you want to read a document, you can ask the university and they are obliged to give it to you. So there is a problem here. And we also now have in Sweden, after a few scandals, a new way of reporting misconduct when it comes to FFP. And the university has a duty to report it. And then it's out open. But so we know that there are some difficulties with our suggestion. But if you want to empower, as Monica says, the young scientists and give them a chance to report this sort, you have to find a solution. And I think our is, as you said, Ole, it might not be the final word, but it is a step in the right direction. You have to have some sort of protections. And I think I talked to some of my friends who are lawyers that it can be done within the frameworks we have today if we are a bit creative. I don't know if that was an answer to the question, but it's very important. And of course, you mentioned, Ole, that many cases are not the serious ones, but they can be very, very problematic anyway. And of course, when you have serious whistleblowers, they will suffer a lot. That's what we know from the literature. So we need a system to protect the system here.
Another question. Thank you, Niels Erik, for these thoughts. I very much agree with you. So here's Bob Siegering, who says, thank you for your thoughts. I am wondering if the seniority of the integrity officer in itself can also be a negative thing. In our institution, we have a younger sidekick, PhD student from a representative body next to the integrity officer, who can also function as point of first contact. Will this be a helpful addition to the proposal? Maybe Gemma, could you comment on this?
Yes, I think that would be helpful. If it someone senior, of course, would have the experience and the perspective to help identify if it's a case in which is a little bit uncertain whether it was misconduct or not. But it might be someone who's quite distanced from the implications of feeling that you have to go forward and report something, and the fear of the retaliation or not receiving the letters of recommendation that you will need in the future, or is this person going to review my grants later on? So it might be a good idea to have a dual process or two people as scientific officers also, so that it's not such only one person making such decisions. So it's a bit of a body of.
Yeah, and here's another sort of technical one. How would you, from Anna Lohmann, how would you ensure that data details of the research can be shared with the scientific integrity official without breaching confidentiality agreements? I don't know who would want to answer that one. It could be any one of you. Maybe Baruch, you could comment on this.
Let me pick up on a comment that I believe that Monique made, which was that these issues are nested in a complicated social, legal, financial architecture that has been created over the years, and there may be needs for wide reforms outside of this specific topic. Just before I got on, I saw that our National Science Foundation had revised its criteria for broader impacts, as it calls, of research when it funds it, which includes a contribution to empowering different populations. So that would be a kind of structural reform that would reward people for something outside of their H index, or the total amount of money outside of their H index. It may be that the confidentiality agreements that are signed are in fact contribute to this problem, and that would be one of the kind of technical details that perhaps Niels Erik was talking about with his legal colleagues.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and there's a question which in a way, to some extent, Niels Erik already has sort of answered, I think, about can larger international bodies, organizations, unions with discipline-specific divisions fill the role of hosting the scientific integrity officers rather than local universities? It may, of course, not be either or, but could be and. But maybe Monique, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think with all of these kind of reforms, we have to do this as wide and as large as possible. We also, so I alluded to the recognition and rewarding, and that it is changing. You can't do that at one country, because then scientists can't be mobile anymore. And I think it's the same for all of these kind of things. So if we want to tackle this, we have to tackle this together. And yeah, maybe that requires changing laws. But if we as well, first of all, as Europe, and then maybe as the world, but that's, I mean, I see how difficult it is to unite Europe in these kind of things already. So then, yeah, I think that would be the only way forward. You can't just do this in one country, because then you also don't help people. Science is mobility, is collaboration, international collaboration. So on all these aspects, we have to do this together. Yeah.
Right, thank you. Well, there's another question here. Should members from the ethics committee that already evaluates the project before it starts also be trained to interfere when there are doubts about misconduct? So this is kind of not totally clear exactly how they would suddenly be told about this, but that would sort of seem to imply that there would be a constant monitoring by an ethics committee of projects throughout, and to what extent that is practical, I am not quite sure. But let's see whether anybody. Niels Erik would like to come in here.
I think we had a big scandal a couple of years ago, and it led to a couple of governmental reports, more than one, and it led to also changing our legal system. And one thing is that we realized that we needed some sort of monitoring. So we have that today. So the National Ethics Review Board can now go to university and see if they've done things right. And it is important that this can be done. Another thing that happened here, which I think is very important, is that we realized at one point that the university was in total control. So if someone reported something, they had seen some misconduct, it was up to the president. He or she was both the one who wrote the law, was the judge, the prosecutor, the defender, etc., and that this system wasn't a good system. It didn't guarantee that the people were treated fairly. So we now have national board. But of course, as Monique says, it is a European problem because we want to have the same standards throughout Europe. And that is why it's important to discuss these questions and maybe have the same system of reporting and a secure procedure throughout Europe. If that will ever happen, I'm not sure, but hopefully we will find a way.
Yeah, Barry, I think wants to come in here.
Yeah, thanks. Following up on Niels Erik and the other comments, something that I found interesting when we were writing this proposal and sending out for review is we would often get anonymous reviewers who would describe to us the technical challenges of implementing what we proposed as criticisms. So, you shouldn't, I don't think you should publish this piece because this won't work because of data sharing problems, or, because there is a duty report. And to us, that always kind of resonated, but I don't think not in the way they intended. They intended these things as criticisms of our report, when to us, they supported the need for it. Like, they weren't claiming the status quo isn't working, and certainly we don't think the status quo isn't working. I mean, you just have to spend a week reading Retraction Watch to realize that the status quo of regulations and technical requirements hasn't solved the problem. So those sorts of criticisms, to us, really actually point to the need for this kind of thing. They aren't, to us, damning. I mean, probably the people making them might think that they're damning, but to us, they're not damning. They're like, no, exactly. Like, how do we solve this in the current framework? Because something like a duty to report, which is clearly made with good intentions, doesn't provide an incentive structure to actually come forward when you're a vulnerable person, like an early career scientist.
Okay, thank you. I think a number of the questions that have come in could be sort of divided in two parts. One are very specific questions. We have dealt with some of those, but a number of them also deal with the more general issue, how to create the right incentives and how to kind of change the culture in general. Whether ethical training should be a precondition for receiving research funding. To what extent do we think that can be a way forward? I mean, clearly, certain things have been positive, I think, in recent years. When I was a young person, there was an enormous amount of emphasis when evaluating people on quantities of publication. Very bad, particularly in the clinical world, let's say, particularly among surgeons, where people were basically weighing how many kilos they had produced. And that seemed to be a major criterion for promotion. And most of the good universities now have gone away from this thing. We want to look at the best papers that people have produced rather than the numbers that have been produced. So that's one good development, I would say. However, there may be other things that are needed in order to create the right kind of incentives. And one thing that has struck me anyway, to take up that theme, which is sort of alluded to by some people, although not made very explicit, do we have enough incentives in our system that rewards findings that actually turned out to be right? The problem with a lot of evaluation also of early career researchers is that it happens in a relatively short-term considerations, acute evaluation after a couple of years of a grant. And we don't seem to have, apart from maybe at the very high end when people are elected to prestigious academies or get big prizes and so on, but that's really only a relatively small segment of the scientific community that even comes close to that type of situation. But otherwise, we don't seem to have many rewards in the system for actually acknowledging that something was right, actually. But how to do that, I don't know. That's a big question. But the question of the right incentives has come up in quite a few questions. And do we have enough of the right incentives? Baruch?
I think that we collectively owe a big debt to those early career researchers who have blown the whistle, who've been brave enough and sometimes risking their career to blow the whistle on misconduct, and who have promoted, along with some more senior supporters, things like the open science framework that have made appropriate procedures the norm, and have denormalized the pathology that has crept into some of the sciences where the incentives were misaligned. So this is a kind of bottom-up process that could collaborate with the kind of top-down process that Ola was suggesting, and Monique and Gemma have. We need both kinds of reform.
But do you think that, yes, in some individual cases that certainly is right, but is that the way forward in terms of improving the system over a kind of on a larger scale? I'm not quite sure about that, and I still think we may have to think about creating somewhat different incentives and having to look at evaluation. Monique mentioned something about creating a better evaluation system. And maybe some concrete suggestions there could be helpful. I don't know. Oh, sorry, Nils. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you. You mean then evaluation systems that are evaluating the research that we are doing or the young scientists are doing? Because then you say you want to promote things that are right, but I think that part of science is also that you're allowed to do things and you do not succeed, but you did it in a very, very good way. And it turned out it didn't work, but you can say he or she did an excellent job in doing that, because that is also part of the scientific enterprise, and what we in the end hopefully reach a point where we say, now we know this. And so that's also
I think that creating an environment where individuals have, they can operate, they can do science, they can make mistakes as early career researchers, and have it be a tolerable job, have it be a tolerable career where you're not going to be abused, where you're not going to have so much pressure that even if you can sort of get through one hurdle, the second hurdle, the third hurdle, that there's some unending set of hurdles. I think this is sort of a really important system that we need to construct. Having incentives that are outside of the university, so the scientific integrity officer can help, but outside of the university really helps. So for example, the suggestion from one of the members of the audience of having the IRB be connected to some issues of scientific integrity. So for example, there's adverse event reporting for dangers to human subjects. There could be adverse event reporting for problems with the researchers or dangers to the actual researchers themselves, which could be from scientific misconduct. That leads to a loss of the license to operate on the part of the researcher, which creates a really very strong incentive for senior faculty, senior researchers to avoid that type of misconduct and to treat their students and their early career researchers with respect and dignity, and really listen to the types of issues that the early career researchers might be worried about. So that's one example. Scientific bodies are another one. But if it's just, as mentioned by Monique and Gemma, I mean, if it's just inside the institution, there's always going to be a protection of the people who bring in the most money, the people who are the most value to the institution. And so there needs to be some collaboration with external instruments.
Yeah, I would just like to reply back to Eric, what you said before. You're right, of course, there can certainly be failures, and that's not a bad thing. However, coming from an experimental science, I would say it is perfectly natural, and it will happen in most cases, that the interpretation of results will turn out to be wrong. But I would like to think that the actual data were right.
Yeah.
So there's an important distinction here. The data should be correct. They should be reproducible. Interpretations will obviously change because we gain more knowledge as we proceed. But I think evaluation is clearly critical, and for early career researchers, it's very critical indeed. So one has to think very carefully about that the evaluation systems are appropriate and that they actually are helpful in the sense that they reward good behavior and do not reward behavior that is not helpful to society and to science in general. And it is not entirely clear that the current evaluation systems are actually entirely appropriate in this sense. And maybe this is an important duty also of academic societies to weigh in here and actually think about this problem. It's clear that institutions will act in accordance with their own interests, which at the moment seems in many cases be to maximize research income. And there is a conflict perhaps there in some cases between that aim and the aims of science actually to make progress on secure grounds and also to train researchers in the right kind of way.
They shouldn't. I think you are right about this. They shouldn't encourage misconduct, and but again, that shows that you need a mechanism of the type that we are suggesting. But I completely agree with you, Ole. It's a very important point you make.
There is another interesting question here, which relates again very specifically to your paper. So Tony W. says, the process stressed that action would only be taken forward with permission of the individual making the disclosure. However, do you think this could always be guaranteed? For example, might there be a duty of care to ensure other individuals are not at risk from the behavior? Another example might be if there was potentially criminal activity, perhaps fraudulently securing funding from a public source. So that relates very specifically to your proposal and the possibility that one might decide not to take action. But in some cases, that might not be entirely correct. I don't know who would want to respond to that. Probably one of the authors of the paper.
Barry was nodding.
Oh, that's Eric.
No, Barry. I think Barry was nodding, so I think he has the answer.
Okay.
No, I was just agreeing that that's a pernicious problem. I don't know what the answer is.
I mean, our thought was that, given how complicated these are, difficult questions, we are, one could say, assigning responsibility to somebody to sacrifice their career for the sake of some unclear protection may be an immoral responsibility that enables institutions to wash their hands of their own obligation to protect people. Having somebody that one can talk to, a wise person, to sort out these issues is one way of reducing the burden and of perhaps revealing some structural injustice in the system that makes individuals responsible for taking on the structural malformations.
Yeah, I think there are situations where there is not the absolute right answer. I mean, to that extent, Barry is right. I mean, there are potentially conflicts, and you can't satisfy every requirement. That is, of course, unfortunately, often the case in life that we engage. Of course, in many cases, things may be taken out of the hands. I mean, a young researcher may report something to such an integrity officer as your paper indicates, but things may be taken taken out of their hands because somebody else, an anonymous accusation may arise, letter to an editor of the journal, and then the whole process starts, and it cannot be stopped. And that would very often be actually what would happen in such cases. So sometimes it's not possible to stop it, even if both the ECI in the institution and the scientific integrity officer would both want not to continue. It may actually be taken out of their hands. Then somebody asked another question, which we have not alluded to, but which is quite important. And as a science editor, I also feel this. Has any thought been given to include scientific journals in this endeavor? I'm of the opinion that journals are an important part of the current ethics crisis. And I couldn't agree more with that. After all, at the end of the day, the scientific record is in the scientific journals, and scientific editors obviously have a major role here. And I think it is also the case that scientific editors have sometimes, by their policies, not helped integrity of science. Here I'm thinking particularly in the experimental sciences, where we have these so-called reviewer experiments. So a young first author, an ECR typically sends paper to one of the top journals, let's say Nature, Cell, Science, and after a review comes back a relatively positive letter saying, yes, it's an interesting paper, we might want to publish it, but reviewers have raised these and these concerns. Then comes a very long list of experiments that have to be done. And that's where very often ethical dilemma comes in, and where the character of particularly the ECR, who is the first author of the paper, comes in, because this can be career changing, as we know. A first author paper in one of these journals can be extremely important for your career. So you know in that situation that if these experiments work out, the paper will be accepted. If they don't work out, the paper will not be accepted. And we sometimes refer to these as reviewer experiments. And some people think that they should be labeled as such because they are probably not as secure as the original experiments, because the incentive to get it right is just absolutely enormous, both from the point of view of the ECR and from the senior author. So there is a huge pressure there. And so there is an example where scientific journals are actually not helpful for research integrity, because they create unreasonable incentives that are so strong that it may not necessarily result in fabrication, but it could certainly, in many cases, result in cherry picking and taking out those results that fit in and forgetting and creating some arguments why some other results could be taken away. So that's an example where actually science editors could do something by not going down that route.
There's some work on registered reports where you get very similar type of feedback, but the journal makes a, in principle, commitment to publish the research regardless of the outcome of the experiments.
Exactly.
As long as they are well conducted. And so, hopefully that there would be hopefully the big journals would move on that direction. I know Nature Human Behavior has that. I'm not sure about Nature Proper.
Well, exactly. I mean, the journal that I'm editor of, the American Physiological Society Function, we do exactly that. We make a commitment at the end of the first review period and say that you have to do these things, but irrespective of the outcome of these things, we will publish it. And that, I think, is a very good step towards improving in integrity. Let's see whether some more things are coming.
I think the general point there is just that, being conscious about the pressure and being conscious about the well-being of the early career researcher, right? And this proposal is centered around that, and centered around the people who are going to guide the science the next 20, 30, 40 years, and want to encourage other scientists to join the field, right? And so centering that and making sure that that's at the heart of the the heart of the proposal, and as it's also at the heart of the registered report and the modification you suggested.
No, I think that's absolute key point. I totally agree. You want to create a situation where you don't, let's say, give these false incentives, and don't create a situation where an ECR is, in a sense, becoming compromised early on in his or her career. That, I think, is incredibly important. Let's see what else. Well, here is a question from Wolfgang Greyer. Thank you for your talks and thoughts. Maybe the current reviewing system where peers evaluate process data needs to be challenged as well. Is the approach of reviewed research prior submission, where the peers are part of experimental planning, experiments, data accumulation, analysis, interpretation, that was recently introduced by Scientific Reports, part one of the solution. So that's a specific one. Alexander, you are nodding. Would you want to say something?
I'm pretty sure that's what we just suggested, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So we have answered a lot of the questions. Let me just check whether we have. Yes, somebody asked whether we can have this recorded. It is recorded, and you will be able to see the presentation later on. Somebody asked, how is this proposed procedure different from what POP, peer, and retraction watch do? Do they complement each other? I mean, they are different, obviously. And I don't know whether anybody wants to address that specific question. It seems to me that they are very different, and that they do, to some extent, complement each other. So I don't see any very specific problem there. We are, in principle, already in what you might call overtime. But if there are any further things to be discussed, we can do that. I think it might be helpful, given that discussion has been quite diverse in a way, if we have a quick round, just a few minutes each, just to sort of give a kind of takeaway message from this webinar. And I will just take it in the order in which your pictures appear on my screen, which is not necessarily the same order in which it is on your screen. So I will start with Niels Erik. Since you gave the last presentation, you can be the first one to kind of sum up what you have taken away from this.
What I have taken away from this is that I really appreciate that the Young Academy has participated, and that they see the problems not having a secure mechanism here, and might be working for getting a secure mechanism, because it is, as you all has indicated, the reward system out there is not, it can be a hard life for young scientists, and there are many hurdles, as Alex said. I think hopefully we can find a better system, and a system that protects those who, was it Alex who said it, will be working within science for 30, 40 years. And that is important. So no, that was my reflection.
Okay. Thank you very much. And then I would go to Monique and ask for your sort of concluding remarks.
Yeah, I mean, as we said, we really like the proposal, and I think it nicely fits with all the efforts which are currently going on in Europe, and not so much. I'm not sure if this is the case in the US, but like I mentioned, this whole recognition and rewarding, and for me, this is even an extra argument it's in support of this recognition and rewarding, but the recognition and rewarding is also an argument to set your system in place. So I think they could work very constructively together. And I know it's not just the Netherlands, but also the EU are looking into this. The European Association of Universities have made this a focus, the Initiative for Science Europe. So I think all this, the signs are aligned at the moment in Europe to make this work and to also implement your proposals some way or another to protect, in fact, everyone at all stages in their career. So.
Okay, thank you. Gemma?
Yes, so I also really appreciated, as we said earlier, the positivity around this. So it's not just creating awareness of having a dark cloud with rain above us, but actually what can we do about it? So creating solutions. And I really liked as well how our conversation throughout this hour transitioned from how we make it secure for early career researchers to report, but also what can be the reasons behind leading to scientific misconduct, and can we do something about that, because obviously it's hand to hand, so tied to rewards and recognitions. So I agree with Monique that we have a good momentum at the moment to do something that can make a difference at different levels. So I really appreciated the discussion, and that's what I'm taking home.
Thank you. Barry?
Yeah, just following up on that and also connecting it to the audience member who asked about Retraction Watch and PUB here, I think kind of heartened by the amount of momentum and interest in the topic, and thinking when I was a graduate student, which was just a few years ago, that I learned about these things through discussions with other students at my university, but actually also then by reading Retraction Watch and looking at kind of science Twitter and seeing that people all over the world were worried about these problems and suffering similar things, but also sort of working together and supporting each other. So I have some optimism that maybe we can have a cultural change for the better.
Thank you. Alex?
Yeah, just to build on the previous points, I mean, the institutions of science in any institution are only as strong as the people involved in them, and our willingness to support each other and modify the institutions formally, but also informally, and be that strong advisor for someone else, and be that student who's willing to stick up for another student. So, to the degree to which we can have formal changes, that's fantastic, but also even the informal components that we're, just even having this webinar, and, thank you everyone for putting this together.
Thank you. And Baruch, you gave the first talk, so you will have the final word. So what is your takeaway message?
So I'd like to thank all the 4 organizations who sponsored this, and Ulla for being our moderator. Particularly like to thank the Young Academy for for giving us this reality check on our on our proposal, and and for talking to your members. I think this is I sense that this is a time to act. We've had these successful bottom-up reforms, like really driven by early career researchers in large part. I think the institutions need to adapt to them rather than to them to adapt to as much to the institutions without losing the wisdom in the institution. And I'd like you to feel that you have some later career allies. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. So it just remains for me to thank, first of all, a panel. You've been a wonderful panel, very interactive, and I think we have ranged widely. And I hope it has given some inspiration to the many people who have been listening in. And thank you also, of course, to all those who have raised questions. I hope we have answered at least most of them. And this will be an issue that will continue to be around for sure for a long time. But I think there are various solutions around, and we have alluded to a lot of them today. And I'm also a bit optimistic that we are gradually perhaps moving in the right direction, and hopefully we can create better incentives for everybody. So I will close this seminar now, and once more, thank you very much indeed to all of you for having been with us. Bye-bye.